Has J.K. Rowling won the argument once and for all over Scotland's new hate crime laws? Police Scotland say they won't prosecute her over social media posts which described several transgender women as men. The author had dared police to arrest her. Susan Smith is a director for Women Scotland, a campaign group who support J.K. Rowling's stance. Morning to you, Susan.
Good morning.
Is this as straightforward as we now know that J.K. Rowling won't face prosecution? Simply saying that transgender women are men is not a crime as the police would consider it. So one of the major concerns you have has been removed.
In a way, but it highlights why we had the concern in the first place, because nobody actually knew what was going to happen on the 1st of April. And if she hadn't really pushed hard on this, I think we still wouldn't. So by doing this, she has brought clarity, or hopefully brought clarity, because it would be absolutely dreadful if now the police decided to prosecute somebody else for something similar who didn't have her resources. But so hopefully it's brought this clarity. But the fact is that the government had an opportunity to write this into the bill in the first stage as it was going through Parliament, and they waited until it became law. They waited until the act was passed. They still didn't do anything. The police training's been inadequate. The police training has been not fit for purpose, according to the chair of the Police Federation. So in effect, what she did was do what the government should have done. I'm at a loss to know what the Scottish government has been playing at all this time.
I'm interested in this question also. There's reports that 800 complaints have been made under the new law. And some of them, I know Hamza Yusuf said, some of them, we shouldn't have vexatious complaints. But any complaint has to be looked at by a police officer. And therefore, presumably, even though some of this stuff won't ever get prosecuted, there'll be a certain amount of resource expended just managing the situation and looking for every time someone sends a tweet, someone will make a complaint, and then someone's got to look at it.
That's right. And we've seen activists on Twitter already boasting about having made complaints and getting really cross because the police have said there's no crime being committed. And that's largely because the misinformation has been so dreadful, and it's been misinformation from the government and from the police, as well as the funded lobby groups who actually push to have this dreadful law brought in the first place. So they've had all this misinformation about what is and isn't a crime. They think they're entitled to complain. And then, as you say, the police have to investigate. One of the people complaining on Twitter the other day said that officers have been out to their house. So when you've got thousands and thousands of spurious complaints coming in already, this is a huge stretch on an already overburdened police force.
The downside of the law is, I think, very obvious, and we've just talked about it. And you know, for everyone who believes in free speech, but is there an upside here that we just need to be honest about as well? You might have a transgender person living quietly in Scotland, trying to have their life, being subject to abuse, people stirring up hatred in the terms of the new act. They now get better protection. Someone will be better protected today than they would have been at the end of March. That's a good thing, isn't it?
I'm not sure they are better protected. I mean, actual crime has always been illegal. And we had a hate crime aggravator, which covered transgender people before this was brought in. This stirring up part, I think, is going to be really hard to prove and really hard to prosecute. And that doesn't mean that people aren't going to be investigated. So I think there's going to be a lot of disappointed people on both ends. There's going to be people who have a terrible time while the police undertake an investigation. And there's going to be people who decide that the law is toothless and it's not doing what they were promised, or that over-promised by some of the groups and organisations who got the Scottish Government to put this in. I mean, you know, right at the beginning of this, when the Scottish Government did flirt briefly with bringing in greater protections for free speech, there was an absolute outcry from people who wanted to use this and weaponise this law to go after people and settle scores. And I'm not sure how that will make the life of an individual better, because I think all this does is ramp up an already febrile situation. I think that's going to make their lives worse.
Because in the end, this boils down to people should be nicer to their fellow man and woman, their fellow human being. And the question is whether we're spending an awful lot of time on what amounts to some of it, a social media problem, where actually the solution is people being better. But you can't change people for the better, I suppose, through the legal system very easily. And maybe that's where this falls down, that if everyone were a bit nicer to each other, there wouldn't be a problem. But that's not the real world.
Well, it's not. And also, you know, it's being stoked. So we know there are people out there saying that if you're transgender, your life is going to be dreadful, you're going to commit suicide, you're going to be the victim of crime. And you make people fearful when you push lines like that. And organisations and the government have been pushing lines like that are going to make people feel their lives are terrible. And are going to get worse, and they're going to be on the receiving end of all this vitriol.
But that might be true as well. I mean,
women,
a lot of trans people would say that is true of their lives. I mean, when they're surveyed, people say they have been targeted by people being hateful towards them.
Well, yes, but it also includes things like the misgendering and pronouns and things like that. So I think as a woman, and knowing this sort of level of abuse women face on the streets and in the homes, I don't think it's comparable. And of course, women weren't protected by this at all. I think that they are stoking up fear unnecessarily. And also, I do believe that if Scotland is this terrible place, which we keep hearing the First Minister going on about how hate crime's on the rise and people are people are living in fear. If Scotland really is this horrible, benighted country, I want to know what the government, who's been in power for years, has been playing at all this time, because they could have been sorting out social policies and education that might have helped tackle this. You don't deal with, if this really is a problem, you don't deal with it by draconian laws to squash free speech. You should have been dealing with it at source.
Well, we're going to try and talk to the SNP on that very issue. We asked them a couple of days ago. We'll try again to get their view on that. Susan, good to speak to you. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you.
That's Susan Smith, Director of For Women Scotland.